Hello and welcome to Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast, a podcast where we discuss all things relating to your well-being, ranging from nutrition to physical and mental health. I am Amanda Hayes, your host, a nutritionist with a passion for well-being. Before I introduce today's guest, I will take a moment to let you know that you can subscribe to my podcast on YouTube, hit the red subscribe button, or on your favourite podcast app, including iTunes, Stitcher, Spreaker, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. I will also mention that although I will often be speaking with experts, any information or advice provided in Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast is not intended to be used to treat, cure, or prevent injuries or medical conditions, and it is not a substitute for advice from your own health professionals. Today I am here with Dr. Scott Coussens. First of all, I'd better mention where we met. Scott and I were both competing in the Cairns Ironman triathlon in June this year. I did the half Ironman and Scott, great respect, completed the entire thing. When I started chatting to Scott, I realised he was wearing a University of South Australia cap. Who would have thought that would be such a magnet? But it was, and well, here we are now. Scott works at the University of South Australia in the School of Psychology, Social Work and Social Policy. He is an expert on sleep. His areas of specialty include electroencephalography, more commonly known as EEG, sleep and child health, and the interrelation between the latter two. Scott has published numerous papers on the topic in peer-reviewed journals, and the subject of his thesis was an examination of the nature of sleep fragmentation in children with sleep-disordered breathing. Got that out. In today's discussion, we're going to focus on sleep. Sleep, one of the pillars of well-being, along with nutrition, movement, social connection, and stress management, is arguably the most neglected in modern society. We'll be discussing the importance of sleep, what happens when you give it short shrift, and how you can improve your sleep hygiene. Hello, Scott. Welcome to Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So many of us have heard of the different cycles of sleep, like REM, rapid eye movement, and deep sleep. Can you explain to us the different cycles of sleep and what's going on in the brain in terms of brain waves during each cycle?
Yeah, sure. Well, the cycles of sleep is slightly different to the stages of sleep,
Okay.
which is what you were mentioning there, the REM and non-REM. And
Are they stages or cycles?
yeah, so they're the
stages.
stages of sleep, which are sort of distinct neurophysiological states that the body's in and the brain's in when you're sleeping, and the cycles is a sort of progression of those through the night, and so you cycle in and out of the different stages in a particular pattern.
Right.
So I can tell you about both, but I'll start with the stages. They're like the building blocks.
Sure.
So you have it's basically divided into two stages. One is non-REM and one's REM. And the REM is the rapid eye movement stage, which is characteristic of REM sleep, and so they decided to call the ones that aren't REM non-REM, which is not very imaginative, but it is what it is. There's a bit of historical momentum, and so and non-REM sleep was divided into 4 components, but now tends to be 3. Now, the Americans made a change, and we do what the Americans do, so we follow them along. But you basically have a very light stage of sleep, which some people don't even really consider sleep, which is a transitional stage, and that's stage 1 non-REM sleep, and that's it's very much like wake in what the brain looks like, but it's a bit slowed down. You'd have a bit of synchrony in the brain waves. Your eyes are rolling gently. You lose a bit of muscle tone. So that's how sleep's characterized. It's generally, there are lots of other things going on in the body, but it's historically been a way of telling the difference between types of sleep by just measuring brain activity. Electrical brain activity is called EEG, and then the eye eye movements, and muscle tone. So we measure those three things, and then you get an idea of the different types of sleep.
Sure.
And so the first stage is like rolling eyes. So stage one sleep is, like I said, it's not really not always characterized as a true sleep stage. It's sort of a transition between wake and sleep, and it has some other characteristics that aren't just in those measures that people are probably pretty familiar with. One of them is called hypnagogic jerks, which are little kicks and jerks of your feet and legs, and you can often tell if you have a bed partner or you see a child going off to sleep, they'll kick a little bit just as they're going off to sleep. There's little discharges in the motor cortex that tend to create this characteristic sleep onset jerks of movement. And you also have hypnagogic hallucinations. Hypnagogic just means sleep onset. So you can actually have quite vivid hallucinations, often things like people will report things like doorbells ringing or knocks at the door or people calling their name, or even visual hallucinations are quite common as well. So, but most people aren't really aware of them, are quite used to it and just drift off to sleep. But if you actually focus on it a bit, you can notice the strange effect of this sleep transition. But then you start getting into the true sleep stages. And so the next deepest sleep stage is non-REM stage 2, and that's sort of slower oscillations again in the brainwave activity, often a bit more of a drop in muscle tone, and pretty much a drop away of any eye activity. There's not much eye activity at all. And so then you also have other, what they call graphical elements, these things that happen which aren't part of the wave pattern. They actually intersperse through the waves in the brain. So you have these little sudden bursts of energy called sleep spindles and K complexes. Right. And these are characteristic little shapes in the EEG that occur, and they're related to what that stage does, which I guess we'll get back to at some point. Can't cover that right at the moment. And then the next deepest stage, which is slow wave sleep, which is like what it sounds. It's the brainwave activity is very slow, very high amplitude. It's this slow pulsing brainwaves, and pretty much no eye movement at all, and low but not the lowest muscle tone. And this stage is the very deepest sleep stage. It used to be split into two. So you'd have stage 3, which was a transition into this slow wave sleep, which was called stage 4. But now we tend to combine them for clinical and research purposes, just sort of squish it into one slow wave sleep stage, which we call non-REM stage 3 or N3. Sorry.
So I was going to say, so we cycle through those.
Yeah, and so what you do is you start off generally. I mean, people never quite behave themselves like they do in the textbooks, but generally what you'll see is someone starts off in stage 1 at the start, or they're awake and then they go into stage 1, and then they should briefly be in stage 2, but at the start of the night they quickly transition into these deeper stages 3 and 4, or just 3, slow wave sleep, and you'll spend quite a bit of time there, and then you cycle up out of that stage, usually with a sort of a movement or an arousal to end that stage, and then you might go into a brief period of REM sleep. Sorry, I forgot to cover REM sleep. So REM sleep, which is also known as paradoxical sleep, because it's not like the other stages. Right. It actually took them a long time to discover this sleep. One, because they had amplifiers and equipment that would only work for a short period of the night. It doesn't tend to show up until later in the night.
I see.
And so they didn't realise that this was happening. And also it looks a lot like wake, so they thought they were capturing wake to some extent. But then eventually, in about the 1950s, they discovered this paradoxical sleep, which had paradoxically, wake-like brain activity. It had this high frequency, low amplitude, real mixed, not very synchronous looking EEG, which is very different from sleep because it's very synchronous EEG in sleep. And that had a lot of eye movements, whereas the other sleep stages tend to have no eye movements, and had almost no muscle tone. You're basically completely immobilized, and so it was paradoxical within itself, as well as being paradoxical in terms of its relationship to the other sleep stages. And so that's the next one. After you come out of deep sleep, you tend to go into this REM sleep for a little bit, and then start cycling through again.
Do you cycle through in the same order or not?
Well, if you look at a hypnogram in a textbook, yes, you do. If you look at a real person, they do all sorts of things. And some people are very naughty and start off the night in REM sleep. And
that's very confusing for the scientists.
Yes, because it looks like awake. And so you don't... but that also tends to be associated with some problems like narcolepsy.
Okay.
So people with narcolepsy tend to start their night with REM sleep, or start sleep onset often with REM sleep. Also, very young children or babies will sometimes start, or very soon transition into this REM sleep. In babies, they have different names, but it's basically the same idea.
So, Scott, why do we have different stages of sleep?
Okay, so the short answer to this is that it's not really known. And I mean, that's sort of why I got into sleep research, because there was so much not known, so much room still for discovery. So it's a very interesting area, but some things are known. And we know that that most animals have this, and so it's evolved and it performs certain functions. So each stage has a role to play, and we don't know 100% what these are for. Like most things in psychology and in neuroscience, we are only just scratching the surface. And in sleep even more so, because it's so much more recently seriously studied.
I would say the same about nutrition. We're just scratching the surface as well. There's
Absolutely.
so much to learn. It's sort of classified as a new science. So if we're not really sure what happens, and you said there are some things we do know, for example, the body does repair itself during sleep. Is that right? And does that happen in all the stages, or more in one or another? Or?
So we tend to have these different drives and rhythms within our body and within the environment that drive our sleep, so that the slow wave sleep that I was talking about is primarily driven in a sort of bottom up sort of fashion, if you understand that terminology, like systems of way, like a bottom up approach, where and this emerges from the interaction of those neurons all being connected together, and it's to do with basically the accumulation of the waste of metabolism during the day. So that's you have adenosine triphosphate as your main energy source of neurons, and as the day goes on, you're going around that cycle and creating diphosphate, and then monophosphate, and then finally adenosine. And once that adenosine builds up, this is called the S process, and the S process drives us to feel sleepy. The longer we're awake, the more sleepy we feel, because basically we're accumulating metabolic waste in our brain. And so then when we go into deep sleep, this slow wave sleep, we tend to, amongst other things, perform a sort of a function which is homeostatic in nature and preserves the body. And there's been a number of different theories about cleaning out that waste. There's even been a recent thing where it's sort of like it's almost like a chemical bath that
I've heard that.
proffuses through the brain,
Yeah.
and cleans out that waste and restores the energy. There are so many theories around sleep, and probably a lot of them are, or have some truth.
Yes.
And this is one of them. It probably, seeing as it's driven by this homeostatic process, you assume that is what it's doing during the sleep process, is actually cleaning that out again, because at the end, your cells sort of recharged in a way. I know that's not a very good way of stating it, but so that's more about the preserving the integrity of the cells, keeping them alive as living things.
And also, I believe it sleep helps us consolidate various memories.
Exactly. So another part of that drive is that when you're awake, new experiences and things, what happens is the different connections that are made within the cortex between the cells. There's a sort of a chemical build-up of increases in connections between different neural circuitry that builds up, and you can imagine that you couldn't just keep adding to that. At some point you've got to...
The brain might explode.
Yeah, you couldn't just keep adding and adding to it. It needs to be, and what they call consolidated at some point. And so a current theory, which probably, it is matched a fair bit by different pieces of evidence that we can gather, but of course it's very hard to study a living brain, especially a sleeping living brain. It tends to restrict us a bit. But you can imagine a build-up of connections and a build-up of strength of those connections during the day, and then during that slow wave activity, what's known as a downscaling. So you actually remove those connections, ready to some extent for the next day's input. But you don't want to just wash excuse me, my hand's flailing around. You don't want to just wash everything away. You want to learn from those experiences of the day. And we sort of consider the brain a predictive tool. It's a predictive mechanism.
I see.
And so if you have a model that predicts things, and then you've got all these new experiences, you incorporate that into the model, and then you can get rid of your sort of receptors ready for the next input, but you need to have kept the important pieces to update your model.
Right.
So if your environment suddenly changed over one day, you wouldn't change everything you believe about the world. But if it kept that difference over the different sleep cycles, you would slowly completely change your model, which is at the core of it. And so that's that other stage.
It sounds very complex.
Well, actually I'm really oversimplifying it.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you are, but I mean, I imagine it is a very complex.
Oh, yes, very.
Yeah.
So they have the slow waves.
Yeah.
And if you remember before, I said about the spindles.
Yes.
And that's thought to be related to taking that information away before you downscale and get rid of the connections, or not get rid of them, but reduce them down so that they can be changed. Because if you just saturate everything, you can't make any changes anymore. Whereas, so you get those connections, you send that to the thalamus. And the thalamus is just another brain structure where it's thought that a lot of these models, in a way, reside. And so this is the time that they can be changed.
Right.
And it's a two-way street. They can talk to one another and reconfigure ready for the next day's input. But then that model is slightly updated. And then so you go downscale, storage, and then you can imagine the REM sleep is almost like the next burst of, all right, now what are we, the next burst of what are we going to do? So you get, what are we going to take from the day? And so in REM sleep you have the selective upscaling and replay of weaker connections that are more recently formed. So that you can imagine these as your more recent things that you've learned or experienced. And then, so they're replayed across the cortex. And then,
is that dreaming or is that something?
And that's dreaming.
Right.
So, well, that's many dream scientists would not be happy with me saying that. But that's one theory of dreaming.
Right.
That it is a component of this replay and re-excitation of weak connections as well as new sensations. And you combine all that together, downscale it, upload it into the thalamus, update your model, and just keep cycling through it. But
so that's how we learn.
That's
constantly updating.
That is a current theory of how we learn during sleep, how memory is consolidated. And some people talk about how the gist of something is extracted, how you can, because you don't remember every single detail. Often you'll remember something like, you remember something that was said that was important, but you can't for the life of you remember who said it or when it was said or anything, but you know what was said. And a lot of these details and things get washed away because you just can't possibly have them all. But the essential parts that update your model, that change how you might approach the world, are kept.
And what about when you think you've forgotten something but someone reminds you and then you remember it? So would that memory have been stored away somewhere in the thalamus perhaps? Or, well, I mean, I know that's getting off the sleep topic a bit, but very curious.
Yeah, so like I said, you don't just wipe out a memory and so it's gone forever. It just gets overlaid by other predictions, other things about the world. And so in a way, all memories are still there, but they're not the same. They're altered. They're part of a new model of the world.
Right.
And so given the right circumstances, you could draw these things out because, they were once part of that structure, if you look at thinking about it structurally,
Oh, that's, yes, that interesting, and obviously there's a lot more to learn about sleep, which is kind of fascinating, and what draws you to it, as you said. So I think a really practical question that people would want to know is, how much sleep do we need? Your favourite question.
Yeah, I always get asked this. And it's not, and people think that I just give you a number, and annoyingly
yes,
I don't
please.
just give you a number because there are a lot of different factors, so many different factors that combine into how much sleep you need. For one thing, but there are sleep recommendations. There are sleep associations around the world, and they give out these sleep recommendations, and they say, you should sleep between, say, for an adult, healthy person, 7 to 9 hours is about normal, and then 6 to 10 hours might be normal, and that's not very helpful. Particularly, that's a fair range, and younger children, well, the range is even larger. It's like 10 to 16 hours and things like that. That's a pretty broad range. Your kids sleeping, you might not really feel that whether they're getting enough sleep or not, or if you're getting enough sleep or not. But things that determine how much sleep you need is age. So when you're very young, you need a huge amount of sleep.
Yeah.
Like you sleep almost all the time. Like
babies, they just sleep and sleep.
Yeah, they're basically sleeping almost all the time.
Yeah.
And
surprising
then as
you're
you
so busy when you have a baby.
and then you can your requirements drop down as you're getting older, and that's one sort of progression, and then the way your sleep is composed changes as you change as you get older as well. The quality of your sleep determines how much you need as well. And so there are things that can disrupt sleep. How much activity you have in a day. So if you're an elite athlete, they'll often sleep a lot more or have naps and things because of that homeostatic process. Basically, exercise is a very, often not considered it, but a very sort of cerebral activity. It's and there are a lot of theories now that it's not your body that even gets tired. It's your brain gets tired of firing the neurons to force your motor cortex to do things, and that actually gets fatigued.
It's got to be some of both though, because my body gets tired.
Oh, absolutely. I know exactly what you mean, but yes, it's just that this is I think it's called the central governor model, and it's just basically that your brain fatigues and protects you from injuring your body by fatiguing first.
Oh, I see. That does make some sense.
Yeah,
makes you stop.
It does. And so you can, there are these theories now you can get around it and have higher performances. But sorry, I've lost.
We were talking about how much sleep you need, and you weren't giving me a number.
Yes, and annoyingly I wanted. But yeah, so there is also a sort of a distribution of normal sleep across the population, and so if you picked any one person, the amount of sleep that they need, you couldn't just say like 8 hours. If you just, I was going to say throw a dart at someone, but just pick someone randomly in the street and made them sleep for 8 hours, it's probably going to be enough. But that's not necessarily how much sleep they need for optimal performance or something.
I guess for most people it's a bit of trial and error. You kind of work out how much sleep you need. For me, for example, 8 hours is pretty good. I feel good if I have a decent sleep. And I track my sleep now. I don't know how accurately on my Garmin watch, but I seem to get a little tick if I sleep more than 8 hours.
That is good. And there's no question that a decent amount of good sleep does make you feel better and perform well in just day-to-day activities. But there are a lot of other contributing factors, and like people are often talking about the crisis in sleep. And things like
I hear that a lot.
And especially in teenagers is a good example. They have this idea that teenagers aren't sleeping enough. And you look back at some of these old journal articles and old books, and hundreds of years ago, teenagers weren't sleeping enough, and it was like a crisis in society, and gas lamps were going to cause the downfall of society because people were being awoken in the middle of the night and all this sort of stuff. And this is a long historical fear that people have, that their sleep isn't being preserved or is changed. But we've actually dropped several hours of sleep over the last 100 years. Sorry, not 100 years, but few hundred years. The average sleep, if records can be believed, has actually declined considerably over the years. And at the same time, we have basically in that same time period doubled our life expectancy.
Yeah, we have.
Got so much smarter by any objective measure that we have to update the IQ tests all the time so that we're not maxing them out, sort of thing. We have to, a person 100 years ago, or say a person now who scores an average score on an IQ test, would have scored at genius level 150 years ago, 100 years ago or something.
Maybe I'll do an old IQ test.
Yeah. So there could be, and there definitely is, contributions of poor sleep quality due to technological advances and things, or shift work and things like that. So there are things that damage our sleep, but it can't totally determine our health and our ability to function. There's a process in physiology called allostasis, and it's that you adapt. If you didn't adapt, you would be in trouble.
Well, we'd all be dead if we hadn't adapted. With food as well.
Yeah, exactly. And there's an idea like the homeostatic model. It's a very nice model, and it works in most situations. But basically, at a fundamental level, it can't be true. We cannot always just return to this same point. we adapt the point that we return to, depending on our environment.
Well, it's the same as building up your fitness.
Exactly.
You adapt.
Exactly. And you can try, if you don't work harder, your body's adapted and you stop getting fitter.
That's right.
Like you just don't get any improvements. Yeah. And it's the same with sleep to a certain extent. I mean, there are extremes, and yes, if you sleep deprive someone long enough, they will die. And it has terrible cognitive and physical consequences if you sleep deprive people chronically and things like that. But at the same time, this idea that, you could say, you've got to sleep 7.5 hours, and then you sleep 7.25 hours, and does that mean you've got 15 minutes of sleep debt that adds up to 50 days of sleep debt when after 20 years or something? It just
it doesn't make sense.
You adapt. And so not a lot of the problem, but some of the problems of sleep is this alarmist approach to it and the medicalisation of it. Everything now gets treated as if it's a medical problem. And that's the same as sleep. If you have a slightly shorter sleep outside this prescribed range, that's considered a medical problem. Whereas you might just be part of a normal distribution
you just don't need as
in the
much
population. Those extremes, like people always talk about, I don't know, like Margaret Thatcher only had 4 hours sleep a night or 2 hours sleep a night, whatever the numbers are. It was almost certainly nonsense. Like, they just don't, it's just bragging. It's it's a public image. It's PR. It's because that doesn't, on the normal distribution, 4 hours is pretty far to the left. It's not really it's not plausible. But 6 hours is right in there. You could
be.
That's 1 in 100 people or something. That's but they would be treated probably, or if you want to sleep a bit more.
But you'd only be treated if it were a problem. If you had 6 hours sleep a night and you felt great, you wouldn't seek any intervention, would you? So
no, that's right.
So we may not know about those people because they never go to the doctor for sleeping pills.
But when those people are not under their own control but under someone else's control, like children, adolescents, the elderly, and they have someone determining what's right. And so there's been this huge medicalisation of particularly child and adolescent sleep. And adolescents are an interesting case because they actually have a genetically determined shift in their circadian rhythm that occurs around puberty. It basically seems to be to get them to stay up later so that they don't have the parents who get sleepy watching them all the time.
That's definitely our household.
So you have this shift in the circadian rhythm, which is the daily rhythm, and so they tend to be wanting to go to sleep a bit later and wanting to get up later because they still have the same adenosine homeostatic process going on, but they have this shift in the circadian, so it pushes them a bit later in the day, and then and then we force them to get up early to go to school, and then we say, we've got a sleep problem. No, we've got a scheduling problem.
That was one of the questions I wanted to get to actually, because it does seem that people are kind of forced into working or going to school at certain hours, and perhaps it doesn't suit the community or everyone in the community. What do you think? Do you think there should be more flexibility about those things, or?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, from a purely well-being perspective, I absolutely do. And I'm not even sure why it hasn't come about because it seems so obvious.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
But because we've known it for a while, we know that adolescents want to get up later. I mean, everyone that's had adolescent children knows that they're hard to get out of bed in the morning.
Absolutely.
And it's a battle. And they even have been shown to miss school because they missed the first bit, and then they don't want to turn up.
Yeah, yes, I've definitely experienced that with my children.
Yeah, and so it's well known. This is a thing that we know, and it is actually, like in some countries they're starting to trial it. I know in America there's been there are regions that have tried this, and it seems to be successful. But I think results aren't really in yet. In terms of large-scale trials, they might be on. It's not really what I've been looking at in the literature, but I do know that they're at least trialing it, and just that shifting of scheduling to a bit later. Why fight nature?
Yeah, well, we seem to do it all the time.
Well, yes, of course, and to some extent, it's what makes us us.
That addresses in a way one of the things I wanted to talk about. You mentioned the circadian rhythm, and there is some theories that some people are what are called night owls or evening types, and some are morning larks or morning types. So I guess they have a different circadian rhythm. Is that the case? Is that what you understand? And why would that be the case if it is?
Well, one thing is that the true larks and owls are quite rare.
Right.
Because again, the
outliers, are they?
They're the outliers. This like most things in nature, there are a lot of things that contribute to when, this complex system of feedback in your brain that takes in cues from the environment and resets that and drives that circadian rhythm. It's a complex series of external cues plus genetic clocks plus chemical processes. So you could imagine there are a lot of things that could interfere with that. Drugs, I don't mean illicit drugs, I mean any sort of psychoactive substance. And
alcohol as well.
Alcohol, definitely. Your activity levels, but also your genetics, and your habits, your psychology. There are a lot of things that go into contributing to whether you have this propensity for morningness or eveningness. But again, like I said, they're quite rare, these extremes. Most people just fit in to around the middle.
Yeah.
But that's that normal distribution. Whenever in nature you get a highly complex interaction, the weird thing is it tends to fall out as that normal, like a Gaussian sort of distribution where you have a fairly high, the bell curve.
The bell curve, yeah.
Yeah, and so you just sort of tend to have this distribution where most people cluster around a mean, and then, within a couple of standard deviations, everyone's falling, and then you have these tails that go off on both directions, and it's very handy for statistics and also how we tend to behave.
And I guess in terms of the bell curve that you mentioned, that's probably where that 8-hour thing comes from, isn't
8 hours
it? Sort
is
of
right
like
in the
the
middle
peak
of that curve.
That curve.
But I did a study with a group of other people, and there have been several before it, but this was sort of an updated review of children's sleep, and we found, like the previous studies, that nobody almost was getting the recommended amount of sleep.
Right.
And they're all still with us.
Functioning.
And, but, they would, and so then they'll always adjust the recommendation down a bit because no one's getting it. So they're going to move it back to around, make it a bit more sensible. And then they'll test in another 10 years and go, oh, no one's getting the recommendation again, and shift it again. And, I mean, this is just...
Well, it's an evolving science.
We're adapting to our environment, and our environment is very different if you think about the level of physical activity, which drives part of the duration of requirement of sleep and that slow wave sleep.
Oh, that's
you actually have to
sense.
work hard to need to sleep in that slow wave sleep. If you don't do anything, what are you downscaling?
Yeah.
You haven't upscaled in order to downscale. If you have no new experiences, why do you need so much REM sleep?
So I'm going to ask a question in a different way. So Scott, how much sleep do you try and get every night?
I guess about 7 to 7.5 hours. It just seems to suit me.
Yeah.
And you hear a lot of recommendations, but one of the things that I do is I don't set an alarm. Or I try not to. I mean, if I have to get up for a plane, or if it's really important I get up or something, I'll set an alarm. But basically, I'll just wake up, unless I've gone to bed really late. I'll wake up at the time about that I need to get up.
I do the same. I mean, I do set my alarm, but I often find myself waking just before it goes off.
Yeah, and I'm the same. It weirdly like close to when it would have gone off. It's a bit spooky sometimes, but you just sort of wake up and you almost know what the time is. You go, it's about 5 o'clock or something.
Yes.
But, so yeah, I'll tend to get as much sleep as I need to a certain extent. Now I'm a bit of a funny case, perhaps not a funny case, but I actually have narcolepsy.
So what is narcolepsy?
So narcolepsy is sort of excessive sleepiness, and I have a form of so I'm never my doctor. I have a sleep doctor, and I am a sleep doctor. But I have a sleep doctor who explained to me that my case is like a boundary disorder. I'm never fully awake. I'm never fully asleep. I'm a bit of both at all times.
Are you awake now?
Mostly. See, I'm mostly awake at this point. And so I can, but it hits me in waves. So I'll have a wave of sleepiness. It's almost impossible to resist. And people have much worse cases where, because they have a condition called cataplexy, which is with the narcolepsy, and so if they laugh or something rhythmic, and they'll just fall asleep because it entrains them, and they.
Does that mean they can't drive a car?
I'm allowed to drive as long as I have medication.
Right.
I'm not sure actually about people with cataplexy because obviously it's uncontrollable.
Yeah,
like you can't.
Like epilepsy, you shouldn't drive if you're an epileptic.
Yeah, I don't know the sort of legal requirements. I'm not sure what the diagnosis is. There might be a threshold or something.
Probably.
I'm not really sure. But yeah, and so I set myself an amount of sleep that feels right, and I'll wake up, but I can't purely listen to my body because I have.
You've got to override it sometimes. So the next couple of things I'd like to talk about are sleep and health and how they're interrelated, and then also sleep disorders. So perhaps you could tell us about sleep and health. And I know we've been talking back and forth about how much sleep is required, but what happens in an acute sense and also in a chronic sense if you don't get enough sleep?
So in an acute sense, it's very dramatic. Like your mood declines. Like, if you go and they're just doing an experiment currently at UniSA where they're sleep depriving people for, I think, might be 72 hours or around that anyway. It's a fairly long time, and you see dramatic declines in mood, in cognitive performance, in attention, in physical. You don't physically feel well. Body temperature regulation, all that sort of thing. You very high stress response. You have increased cortisol, which impacts on your immune system. So there are a lot of chronic impacts of sleep. So obviously it's very important to have regular sleep.
Yeah.
And if you miss a whole day of sleep, it has a huge impact.
Yes.
Chronic sleep deprivation or restriction is more like what tends to occur to people in shift work. You do actually have reduction in things like attention, and it actually, like I was saying before, you have an adaptation to it.
Right.
But part of the adaptation is that your subjective awareness of it decouples from your objective performance.
Right.
So you start thinking you feel fine, whereas you're actually performing at this lower level.
Right.
So this is like if you chopped off 2 hours of sleep every day. The point I was making before about the amount of sleep that you need not being strictly determined by a single number is because of all these other factors that happen on different days and different times of the year and things like that. It's just so many factors that it's very hard to say one number. But if you go to sleep when you feel tired and you wake up and you feel okay, basically you've had enough sleep.
Yes, yeah.
Without an alarm. If you wake up and feel okay, but you were awoken from sleep, it's not certain that you've had enough sleep, because waking from different sleep stages can be very different.
Yeah, I know. If you get woken up in the middle of the night when perhaps you're in a deep sleep, you feel very disoriented, don't you?
Yes, it can be. It sort of can be almost an emotional experience. Like, to be woken up in these very deep sleep stages can be very disturbing, and to the point where in clinical settings, if someone's in REM sleep and they're sort of replaying a lot of events of the day and things like that, we don't wake them up, or really try to avoid it, because it can actually be quite disturbing, that mixture of the real world and intruding on what was already quite a bizarre combination. Because it's, if you think about weak connections being preferentially connected, that thing, it creates quite a bizarre world in REM sleep, and then if you intrude with the real world, especially for children, it can be very upsetting.
Right.
So we actually, stay out of that. So if you got woken up, if you set your alarm to wake you up, and it was waking up in REM sleep, you will not be happy.
And in terms of chronic sleep deprivation, I've read that it can be linked to like chronic sort of diseases like type 2 diabetes and heart disease. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. And part of the mechanism there seems to be the suppression of your immune system. And your immune system fights things like cancer and dysfunctional cells of all kinds get cleaned up by your immune system. But if you're always stressed because you're not getting enough sleep, then they're not going to do their job.
Yeah.
And all these things that you would normally fight off, you won't.
Yeah.
And so it definitely, if you sleep deprive someone long enough, you will definitely cause them long-term physical health. And that's why they're concerned about children's sleep deprivation, which is a fair concern, because a lot of the modelling of the, like the blood vessels and things that's occurring in childhood, and the neural structures and everything, that's occurring at such a rapid rate in childhood. If you chronically sleep deprive someone at that age, or disturb their sleep chronically, you can impact them not just then, but into the future. You're sort of setting, if you have any animal and you have them in a high stress environment as a child, they adapt, but they adapt in a way that they'll survive, but it sets them up for all sorts of health complications later on. And you'd know that as a nutritionist. That sort of thing happens quite a lot.
It does. And it's just underpins how important sleep is, doesn't it? And the next thing I guess would be interesting to learn a little bit about is sleep disorders. You've already talked about narcolepsy. What about other common sleep disorders like insomnia and sleep apnea?
Right. So sleep apnea is probably one that most people are familiar with.
Yeah.
And seems to be increasing. It's a bit hard to tell, because a lot of the times when we think things are increasing, it's just that our ability to find them is increasing, and we not really, not necessarily have the greatest statistics for previous generations and things, but it would sort of make sense. One of the predisposing factors for obstructive sleep apnea is increased adipose tissue. So if you're fatter, you're likely to be, you're more likely to have sleep disordered breathing, which includes this obstructive sleep apnea. So obstructive sleep apnea is basically like your airway becomes partially or fully blocked periodically during sleep, and then your body goes through a process of arousing you briefly out of sleep because you remember we were talking about that reduction in muscle tone during sleep.
Yes. And
to reintroduce patency to the airway, to get that airway open again, one way to do it is to splint it open with increased muscle tone. But it's a bit hard to selectively just increase the muscle tone of the pharynx. So the whole body just arouses and pushes it out of sleep stage that it's in, and often REM, because that's the lowest muscle tone, so it's the time when it's most likely to collapse, and then it sort of rouses out of this very important sleep stage, which is, building up, helping in that memory consolidation process. So that's one of the features of it.
Yeah.
And then re-establishes patterns the airway, the person starts breathing, and so you'll hear like they'll either stop breathing or snore increasingly loudly, and then there'll be a choking, and then the person might move or start breathing.
Yeah.
And then it tends to build up again, and as the airway collapses again.
I think that's really interesting because I know some people, including my husband, sorry Chris, that do suffer from sleep apnea, and they don't realise that when they wake up in the morning feeling tired and with a headache, they don't realise they've been partially waking up all night.
No.
And anyway, at my insistence, Chris recently had a sleep test and was diagnosed with sleep apnea, and now he's got his little CPAP machine, which I have called my best friend. It is an absolute miracle. He doesn't snore at all anymore. It's great, and he says he feels so much better.
Yeah.
So
it has been one of the more successful interventions with people with sleep apnea. Just splint, instead of the airway having to be splint open by increasing muscle tone, you just blow it in, and it increases that pressure and keeps the airway open, and tends to reduce those arousals and stops that cyclic process, and it does definitely increase people's feelings of well-being, as well as more objective measures too. It tends to be rolled out almost for everything though, and it, like most things, it doesn't cure everything, and there are sort of variants of the disease that it's not very helpful for.
Sure.
And people that just can't use it, and so there are a number of other interventions that people have that are much less successful, different drugs and surgery, and even doing sort of exercises with the muscles of your throat and things. There are lots of things that people have tried, but they don't tend to be as successful.
What about losing weight? Can that cure it in someone who...
I was hoping to slip that in somewhere.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. That I think that often people, because CPAP's so successful, they ignore the fact that it was probably that they were overweight in the first place. And this is not always the case. There are many phenotypes of obstructive sleep apnea that occur due to purely anatomical reasons that are nothing to do with being overweight. But basically the proportion of people that, say if you're a man over 40 who's overweight, you probably have sleep apnea because you've lost a bit of muscle tone, you've got all this tissue pushing down on your airway and also stopping your diaphragm from moving as effectively to increase that interpleural pressure, and so you end up, you have a chronic disease caused by being overweight, and you cure it by putting a machine on your face rather than dealing with the actual issue.
Yeah, not treating the cause.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a good, sometimes because of the chronic sleep disruption caused by obstructive sleep apnea, people just don't have the energy to deal with actually losing weight, to do the exercise needed, to focus on, making healthier choices otherwise. And so sometimes this is a good intervention in the short term to get people on the right path. But I think it tends to get used as basically, now you've got your machine,
off you go.
This is it for you for the rest of your life. And it probably, in a way, does work. It does help people.
It certainly helped Chris and me, because I don't have to listen to him snore. Well,
that's the other side of it, is that sleep disorders often disturb not just the person suffering from them, but many others.
And what about insomnia? What do we know about that?
So insomnia is a bit of an odd beast because it's partly psychological in character. It's not so easy physiologically to describe it. There's the sort of a sleep onset insomnia and sleep maintenance insomnia, and they both have psychological components. And true insomnia, type 1 insomnia, is relatively rare. Very rarely come across someone who genuinely physiologically can't sleep, and then there are genetic cases, where there's fatal familial insomnia, where you really can't sleep, and over the course of years you slowly lose the ability to fall asleep, and eventually you die from it. The end stages are pretty nasty. You end up having about 6 months of basically no sleep, and then you die.
Wow, awful.
And but that's very rare. That's extremely rare. And then type 1 insomnia is also quite rare. And then what people think of as insomnia is either a misperception of their sleep. So they think they haven't slept. I've had many patients through clinics where they might sleep 7 hours, and you say, how was your sleep? Oh, I didn't sleep a week.
Right.
And it's like they just have a misperception of their sleep. But of course, that's very powerful. If you feel that you didn't sleep, that's almost as bad as not sleeping. And they have actually done this. Yeah. They've done this experiment many times. But one interesting one was they got some university students, and they said, we've got this machine, it was complete fraud, but they had this machine, and it would tell you how much REM sleep you had. And they told the kids basically what I was telling you, how important REM sleep is. And then you put your finger in the machine, and it tells you how much REM sleep you had the night before. And then they went and did a cognitive test. And the ones that were told that they didn't have enough REM sleep performed worse than the ones that were told that they had lots.
That is fascinating.
And so this perception of your sleep is so powerful. And that's why I was saying sometimes we have to be careful about telling people they've had bad sleep, this medicalisation of sleep, because that itself can cause problems. I mean, it's important to identify when someone's not having enough sleep, and it's important to treat true sleep disorders, but sometimes the cure is worse than or even the diagnosis is worse than the disease.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. And the other thing that I think would be really useful for our listeners to know is what you hear of as sleep hygiene. So what are some of the things you would recommend to assist people in getting a good night's sleep?
Well, the main things are light and noise and temperature. So you should sleep in the dark, basically. A lot of people have a lot of lights on, and even small amounts of light aren't great. They can mess with your circadian rhythm, because even through your eyelids, you're still getting information through to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is a part of the brain which helps to determine. It's like a genetic clock, but it gets information from the outside world, and it helps to set your rhythms. So it's getting weak signals which disrupt it.
Right.
I mean, they're not particularly powerful because these are just low levels of light.
Right.
But basically, you should sleep in the dark. Yeah. I mean, and if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense.
It does.
We basically slept in the dark.
Yeah.
And low noise is good. There has been studies that have shown that different noise frequencies interfere with sleep. It's a bit hard to measure exactly, but low noise environment, especially for children, and low light environment, if you can do that with children, but low noise, low light, and basically relatively cool sleeping environment. You don't want to be too hot, because part of the sleep onset process is a dissipation of body heat. You move it to the periphery, and you dissipate heat, especially out of your feet. And so
don't sleep with socks.
Don't sleep with socks. Yeah, and there's a very famous sleep researcher that I've worked with called Mary Cascaden, and she was part of the old, I shouldn't say that, the original sleep researchers, really setting this field up in the 1970s. Certainly not the original ones, but really establishing it on a more scientific footing. And basically, in her sleep labs, they don't let them wear socks.
Yeah.
Because it disrupts that process of dissipating heat and moving it to the periphery, and slows their sleep onset, and it distorts things.
What about electric blankets? A big no-no?
I just don't like them. I'm prejudiced against electric blankets.
I bet you are.
But I mean, I guess you've got to be comfortable and everything. It's not so much that there's this one rule. It's just that most people tend to need it dark and quiet, and the ability to move heat in the way that their body wants to. And I think that it depends on your body size. Like my energy movement is going to be very different from yours, just from sheer body mass differences.
Size,
So you got to be comfortable.
And what about trying to go to bed and wake up at the same time each day? Because you do hear that something you should do.
So those sort of patterns tend to be helpful in establishing, because part of, like I was saying, the perception of your sleep is very important in how you feel. And if you go to bed at the same time, you're basically training your brain to do something, and then it does it and you feel good about it. It worked. So when you only have to stay awake about 20 minutes, and you feel like you've had a terrible night's sleep, and it's just that you stayed awake extra 20 minutes. You might have slept the whole rest of the night.
Oh, that's interesting. It's not much.
Or woke up for just a few minutes, a few times during the night, and you feel like you've had this terrible night's sleep. But it's that, especially the ruminations and going over stuff before sleep, it can be very impactful on how you perceive your quality of your sleep, and then that impacts on how you feel the next day.
And what about not looking at your computer and television and things like that, the type of light that you look at before you sleep, is that important?
I believe that it is. It's what I've heard from researchers that are looking at those things. That's not my area exactly, but certainly I've worked with people that are doing those experiments, and they suggest definitely reducing that well before, because of those cues. You can imagine that bright light would be giving very confusing cues to the parts of your brain that determine the different cycles that are going on, and like the circadian rhythm. And so you want to minimize that bright light exposure late at night,
as you're getting ready for sleep.
I mean, basically part of a cure for a treatment perhaps for some sleep disorders, like some insomnias, or just problems around maintaining sleep, is that you get bright light therapy, which is that you get exposed to really bright light early in the morning. And there have been some studies that show that resetting of your cue is enough to help you sleep later on. And so if you're also giving yourself bright light therapy just before you go to bed, and I mean, it's nowhere near the same, but it's confusing. It might be enough. But also that rumination, that you might be looking at your computer because you're checking an email, and then your boss says you've got to come in for a meeting because you're in trouble, and that's not going to help you sleep.
No.
So it's that shutting off from worries and things as well.
As well as the light.
Sort of, it's almost more psychological than physiological to some extent. Such a powerful impact of that sleep onset.
Now I'd like to move away from sleep a little bit and go to the opposite end of the scale. And just, as I said in the introduction, Scott has done an Ironman. Well, he's done more than one, but we met up in Cairns where we were both running around and swimming and riding and things. And so first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
So how did you find it? Did you enjoy it? Find it hard?
Did I enjoy it? That's an interesting question. Not at the time. Increasingly less through the day. But, it was very hard, and I don't know exactly why, because I was training quite a bit, but I found it harder this time. I think some of the those headwinds were pretty tough.
Yeah, they were on the
Drained
bike.
me a bit. Had a great swim, and then the cycle wasn't too bad, but I really found the run very challenging, and I met a really nice Kiwi guy who helped me through the last 2 laps, which is about 20 k's. He was marching and I was running. He's an ex-soldier. And
he was marching, really?
Yeah, he was marching because that's all we had left, and I was running when we were the same speed. So we just went together, and I think that's actually a big part. I really owe a lot to that guy.
To the soldier.
Yeah.
Would you do another one?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm already making plans. I'm hoping to go to Busselton in 2020, and maybe Melbourne in February for the half.
And so my final question that I like to ask all my guests, if you could recommend 2 things that people could do to improve their well-being, what would they be?
So I suppose you think I'm going to say something about sleep. But no, I would say get outside and move more, and eat less rubbish, eat less sugar.
Yeah.
That would be my 2 things. I think to some extent sleep would take care of itself.
If you did those other things?
If you did those other things. It's like if you have sleep is like life. You know, it's not this thing that happens to us. It's us being alive. It's like saying you have bad wake, you know, and if you have, and if you have bad wake, you don't do anything healthy. You don't look after yourself. You're gonna have bad sleep. Yeah. So do the things you can when you can control them. Move more, eat well, and
sleep will come.
And sleep, and well, not for everyone. I mean, people, there are real disorders, but for most people, it isn't that they have a disorder that they need to take sleeping pills. That's the worst thing you can do. Well, I shouldn't say that because there are some people that really need it, but I just mean for the majority of people, it isn't that you need sedatives or something. You need, some positive things in your daily life.
An overall well-being focus. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Scott. It was a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.
And that was Dr. Scott Coussens. I found that discussion really interesting and hope that you did too. You can subscribe to Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, and while you're there, click on the bell to be alerted when new episodes are available. You can also subscribe on your favourite podcast app, iTunes, Stitcher, Spreaker, Spotify or Google Podcasts. And you can follow the podcast on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. Direct links to all social media can be found on the subscribe page of my website at www.amandaswellbeingpodcast.com. If you would like to contact me, you can send me a message via the contacts page on my website. Please feel free to suggest topics you'd like to learn more about and people you'd like to hear interviewed, and I'll do my best to deliver that to you. Producing the podcast is a labour of love. We put in a lot of time, money and effort behind the scenes. So if you enjoy Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast and would like to make a contribution via Patreon, PayPal or Amazon to help ensure we continue to provide you with excellent content, please visit the contribute page on my website. Finally, please take a minute to leave a rating on iTunes. It improves visibility and will help me source excellent guests. Thank you for tuning in. Eat well, move well, think well.